Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Ask the Doctor webinar for tonight. My name is Shelley Korean with SkyPass Foundation. It seems like it's been a while since we've been with you guys. I think we took a break last month, and the month before that we had an in-person event. So we're glad to be back with you. I hope all of you are doing well. We are here tonight to discuss Parkinson's disease epidemiology, emerging research, and the effects of COVID-19 on PD, along with some other interesting topics related to some clinical trials and research that our guest for tonight is involved in. And speaking of our guest for tonight, we're excited to welcome Dr. Carolyn Tanner from the University of California, San Francisco, who is involved in some really exciting things that I know all of you have questions about. So we're excited to dig into that. But just a little bit about Dr. Tanner before we jump in. Dr. Carolyn Tanner, UCSF, has a clinical practice that specializes in movement disorders. Her research interests include the descriptive epidemiology, environmental and genetic determinants, biomarkers, early detection, non-motor disease features, and clinical trials. She leads the Fox Insight Online study and is a co-principal investigator of the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative study by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, the TOPAZ study, the Micro PD study, and studies of military service-related exposures and PD risk in Camp Lejeune and the Millennium Cohort. I actually just spoke with someone earlier today that had questions about that, so I know that this is a hot topic. Dr. Tanner has been fortunate to mentor talented scientists from many countries who themselves are now leading researchers and educators worldwide. So again, Dr. Tanner, thank you so much for being here. We're excited to learn from you and to hear about all the exciting research and trials that you're involved in. We also have with us Dr. Shilpa Chitnis. Dr. Chitnis is a movement disorder specialist at UT Southwestern, and she serves on our board here at SkyPass Foundation, and she will be conducting tonight's interview. But of course, we want you guys to be a part of the conversation. So if you've got any questions or any commentary, feel free to put that in the chat box. We do ask that topic-related questions go in the Q&A box you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Any other commentary or stories that you want to share or interaction that you want to engage in with each other can go in the chat box, and that'll allow us to easily track the questions that are coming in. So with that, I will turn my video off. I'll be back with you guys shortly, but I will chat with you in the chat box. And Shilpa, we can jump right in.
Yes, thank you so much. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so it's very interesting. You know, Dr. Tanner happens to be the mentor of one of my primary mentors, who I call my quasi-mother, that is Cindy Kumela. And so by that token, you just happen to be my quasi-grandmother, although I don't think.
There you go.
So it's just, you know, I have literally grown up hearing about you from Cindy, you know, Dr. Kumela so much, and the great mentorship that she got from you, and the, you know, really wonderful friendship that you guys have built over the years, which is really, you know, how our movement disorder world is, that, you know, people are so collegial and, you know, you really support each other, and then, you know, end up becoming friends. I mean, I'm really, you know, pleasantly surprised that some of my best friends are people that I have met in the movement disorder world now. So, you know, I guess we are following your pack. So you're definitely a trailblazer. And so I'm really glad that we were able to get you on here. So Dr. Tanner, one of the things that, you know, I did is I basically looked through, you know, your very extensive body of work and picked some questions based on, you know, papers you've published and research that you've been involved with, so that, you know, our audience here really, you know, gets to learn from you and from your experience. So with that, I'm going to ask you the first question as to, you know, this is a question I always get asked. What is the path to prevention of Parkinson's disease, or is there a path? And who follows that path?
Yeah. So I think, you know, one of the really exciting things about the present is that so many people are actually working on understanding the path or the paths to prevention for Parkinson's. I trained in neurology and movement disorders, but also in public health. And prevention is the overall goal. So it's really exciting to me that we're there. I think of prevention as having 3 stages. This is kind of the public health formulation. So the first is primary prevention. And that means we prevent the disease from ever getting started. So that means we have to almost have to know what the causes of disease are to be able to remove them or target them in some way to prevent anything from ever happening. So in that case, we'll talk a little bit later, I think, a little bit more about some of the factors that we think are determinants of Parkinson's, but they may be external to the person, they may be part of the biology of the person. In most cases, it's probably a combination. But targeting those things so the disease process doesn't even begin. That's primary prevention. It's hard to do. Secondary prevention means there may be some beginnings of features, but the actual diagnosis of the disease of Parkinson's hasn't started. So here you can sort of come up with something like identify a slight change and say, this is where I want to go to intervene to prevent things from going any further, to slow down that biological process. And so a lot of the work that we're doing today is focusing on secondary prevention. It's looking at people who may have a minor symptom that we think that we know could lead to Parkinson's, but doesn't inevitably lead to Parkinson's, like people with loss of sense of smell, for example. Some people who have loss of sense of smell go on to get Parkinson's. Most people don't. But if we can figure out who those people are, then we can do something, give them a treatment, give them some lifestyle recommendations to slow disease progression or maybe even stop it from happening altogether. So that's a big area of interest right now that many of us are focusing on. And then the last thing, which I think is helpful for people who have Parkinson's, is what we call tertiary prevention. And this is once you have the disease, once you've got the diagnosis, preventing the inevitable progression of the disease, slowing the burden, the accumulated burden of the disease. So a lot of what we have done in the decades up till now is try to focus on just ways to control symptoms of Parkinson's. And we still are working on that. We're still not perfect at it, but it's very important. Ways to stop progression once someone's been diagnosed. That's a big area of research right now. And ways to prevent the development of parts of disease that are harder for the person who has them, like the onset of dementia or the onset of drug-induced movement disorders. That's another aspect of tertiary prevention. So no matter where you are in that trajectory, there's something that can be done for prevention, which I think is a really hopeful aspect for anyone.
Sorry.
Cannot hear you. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
No, thank you. That is, I think, really important. And, one of the things that we always tell patients, and some follow and some don't, is the importance of, exercise, right? I mean, it is so important. And whether it is, looking at the literature, whether people do boxing or, running or aerobics or Tai Chi or yoga or weightlifting or whatever, just doing some kind of exercise that would potentially stimulate growth factors that could result in, preservation of the dopaminergic neurons would be, such a worthwhile goal. And I hear from patients sometimes, I really don't like to exercise. And I'm like, I really I want your Parkinson's to, be very well managed. And, just as even better than I do, I have patients who've had disease for 15 years. I just had one guy who finally ended up getting DBS, but for 15 years, he had literally, not too many problems. I mean, of course, could he have a minor phenotype, right, of the milder phenotype of the disease? But the thing is that, his progression was definitely, not what one would, one would expect to see. And the only thing that I find in these people is how much they exercise, they exercise quite a lot. Yeah. So just segue into that, what can you tell us about the Parkinson's disease subtypes? And, what, if at all, could be the implications? So firstly is, mild, moderate, severe with progression. And the secondly would be like, if you are tremor predominant versus you have more rigidity and bradykinesia versus having, the PIGD phenotype.
Right. So subtypes I think are a really tricky area the ones you just mentioned, the tremor predominant and the PIGD, which is postural instability gait disorder, PIGD, were described long ago when I was, a young researcher neurologist, when we were doing the data top study, which was one of the very first studies to try to slow progression in Parkinson's in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And what we found is that when people were untreated and just diagnosed, if their predominant feature was a tremor and they had relatively little gait or postural instability problems, they had a more slow progression to needing to take a medication for Parkinson's. These are all early untreated patients. If they had, on contrast, gait disorder and postural instability, then they had a more rapid progression. They needed symptomatic therapy sooner. And so that tends to hold true in many populations, as long as you're looking at people early in disease before they're treated. If you look at people after they've had Parkinson's for 5 or 10 years, almost everybody has some postural instability. They have some changes in their gait, so it doesn't apply anymore. And that's one of the tricky things about subtypes, is that they can be very situational specific. I've worked, and others have worked, to try to come up with other subtypes based on clinical features. And they almost never really replicate across populations. It's a tricky thing. So there are other ways to look at subtypes. For example, people with different variants in certain genes associated with Parkinson's might be considered to be a subtype, because you can identify a genetic feature that is associated with Parkinson's. That could be important because it could have to do with specific treatments that people might be able to be eligible for, mostly not today, except in a research setting, but hopefully soon there will be certain treatments that target people with certain genetic variants. And so that will be an important kind of subtype. Even within those subtypes, though, the clinical features aren't always the same. And in some cases, even if you look at somebody's brain after they've passed away, the pathology isn't always exactly the same. So subtypes in Parkinson's can be tricky, but that part, I think, can be very important. We would hope that we could come up with other sort of biological or molecular ways to define subtypes, so that you could get a blood test, say, and we could say, oh, you have this subtype. That means this is your prognosis. This is the best treatment for you. And we can tell you all these things. But so far, we're not that good. We're still working on it. And a lot of the studies that we're doing are to accumulate enough information that we hope we'll be able to be better at telling people things about prognosis or treatment in the future based on those biologic characteristics.
Yes, definitely. That's we just had a patient today that we saw that basically has a craniocervical dystonia, doesn't have Parkinson's, but just with the age of onset and everything, we decided that we'd send him to our genetic people to just take a look and see if they can identify any gene mutations. And if we are not able to do anything about it today, but who knows what would happen with the way research is going, that we might be able to find something tomorrow. So I think this is a important thing, message to send across to patients is, although it's a smaller percentage of people that have genetic forms of Parkinsonism, but it is really important for them to at least ask their physicians about, especially if they think, oh, my father or my grandfather, should I be and of course there's that big looming giant of the insurance companies, whether they will pay or not, but people do things, like similar to like 23andMe, and try to basically, identify some genes, because as you correctly said, if some of these molecules go into clinical studies, that would be huge implications. So, patients definitely ask their doctors about this.
Yeah, there's also the opportunity, I don't know if you're familiar with it, the PD generation study, where people can actually get they can get genetic testing if they have Parkinson's, with genetic counseling, at no charge. So I think that's another important intervention.
Yes, no, absolutely. And no charges, really helpful, I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
okay, so very good. And so moving along, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, so I'm just kind of as a background, the Michael J. Fox Foundation many years ago came up with a initiative called the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative, or PPMI. And really, like, they've done a lot of things, to try to identify biomarkers, clinical imaging, genetic and biospecimens, to try to see if they can identify some therapies that can, slow down disease progression. So what can you tell our audience about the PPMI initiative?
Yeah, so the PPMI, or Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative, as you said, started 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit more now. And we started out saying we want to identify a biologic marker of progression in Parkinson's to be able to move treatments faster, and in particular, treatments that target disease progression. So that was the reason for setting up PPMI, and we set up an initial population of people with early untreated Parkinson's, people who were controls, and then added some people who were carriers of certain gene variants associated with Parkinson's, and study them very intensively. We're continuing to study those same people today. So they're amazing people. I say, if you're ever down about life, go talk to somebody who's in PPMI, because these are the most amazing volunteers. They are incredible. And so they've been coming in, getting evaluated, having imaging studies, having blood tests, spinal fluid assays, skin biopsies, everything to try to understand ways to measure disease progression so we can move treatment forward faster. We are currently in the midst of adding to this population a much larger group while we continue to follow the other group. And we are now focusing more people who don't yet have Parkinson's, but have some of the features that we know sometimes lead to Parkinson's. So people with rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder, people with loss of sense of smell, people with a family history of Parkinson's, people who haven't been diagnosed with rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder, but have dream enactment, act out their dreams. And then some of the less specific features like, constipation or anxiety, depression that can sometimes go along with that. So we're trying to figure out, is there a way we can identify people at risk, target them, and then be able to intervene to prevent disease. So that's what we're doing now in PPMI. We're recruiting people to be active in the clinical studies. It's an international study, but there are many sites in North America. We are also recruiting people to be in an online study where we collect information over time, and then people may be invited to be parts of other bits of the PPMI study, either in the clinic or other online aspects of it as we go forward. So anyone who's interested, you can search for PPMI or look at the Fox website and click and get more information.
Yeah, absolutely. And NIH, as you know, has a very similar, of course, not as large as PPMI, but a smaller cohort of what is called the PDBP.
That's right.
Parkinson's disease biomarker study that we were, part of for 5 years, and really we collected a lot of very good samples, lots of, motor data, cognitive data, but we also had gait data, and we were trying to look at, changes in gait over longitudinally or progression to see if gait could be one of the things that we could look at as a biomarker. And this is, of course, not something that you can do over just a short period of time, and just perhaps requires lots and lots of years, right? Because the slowly progressive disease.
Yeah, one thing I'll mention is we're also doing something like that now, using looking for digital features, not just in the clinic, but also using a mobile phone. And we're going to be doing that with the the big population as well as the smaller group who are actually in the clinic. So that may help us too, just, with things that people can do on their phone that measure movement or other things that they would report. Also, one important piece about this is that all the data are available to researchers, just like the PDBP project you mentioned.
Yeah.
So that it's not just the people in the study who can use it, but anybody who's a qualified researcher can use it to investigate their own ideas so that we can move science faster.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because this is so fascinating that you can look at PPMI cohorts and people can just data mine and study any problem. So I think this is a really great initiative, and I hope some great things kind of come out of it. What can you tell us about Fox Insight Online and its purpose?
So the Fox Insight study has been going on also for quite a number of years now, and was set up to be able to understand more about sort of the lived experience of people with Parkinson's and people without, and to be able to get information directly from those people. So, participant reported outcomes, to be able to understand more about the disease, identify gaps, have some deep dives to understand factors that may not be understood as easily looking at smaller groups just in individual clinics. So it goes on to this day. We are continuing to ask these very focused kinds of questions to try to understand things like what do people with Parkinson's or people without Parkinson's think about, the different types of interventions, or the different types of research studies, or what are barriers to participating in research? That's one whole question. How did the COVID pandemic impact people with Parkinson's? That's another thing, we were able to get a handle on pretty quickly, because it's an online study. It has, at any given point in time, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people. And many of them answer their questions right away when you put them up there within, a week or so. So you can really learn a lot very quickly from the Parkinson's community.
Absolutely. Really, great information. So what I want to talk about, is also, I guess you've studied the effect of the pandemic on people with Parkinson's disease. So I want to hear from your experience, what is it that you and your group have found about the impact of COVID-19 on PDP?
Yeah, so this was a Fox Insight study, and we were able to do it in the very beginning of the pandemic in 2020, and I think for 2 months, like April and May in 2020. We asked people questions about their experience at that time when we didn't really know very much. It was really scary, and pretty much everybody was, locked down in their homes. And so what we learned, we had relatively few people in the population who had actually had COVID, but comparing the handful of people with Parkinson's who had COVID, I think maybe about 50, to those without, maybe about half that many, we found that the disease symptoms seem to persist longer in people with Parkinson's, and also their recovery was a little bit slower compared to the ones without, even if we equalize for age and sex and things like that. Also, we found that their Parkinson's itself seemed to worsen. They got more symptoms, or symptoms they had got worse. But the even more interesting thing was that people who didn't have COVID, but who just were isolated in their homes, they were cut off from maybe access to medical care. They were cut off from, their exercise classes and their physical therapy and their normal social connections, or the way they usually got exercise, even if they're just like walking or something. And the majority of those people also had either worsening of some of the symptoms of Parkinson's, or actually developed some new features that they hadn't had before the pandemic. So that was early times. I think it helped to flag things that were needed for interventions in the community, and a lot of things happened, exercise classes and, support groups, and almost everything tried to go online. And I think that did make a difference in subsequent months and years as we kept being isolated over the period of time. We have another questionnaire that we have online right now that we're going to be pulling down and analyzing pretty soon. That's looking at sort of the follow-up to that initial COVID survey to see kind of what the longer term experience has been for people.
And I think it's just psychologically been also really, people have been cooped up. I mean, man is a social animal per se, and and we
Right.
know that Parkinson's patients. I mean, it's like that Parkinson's personality, right? Where you want to kind of hide and you want to be more indoors and not want to go out and do things. And having the pandemic kind of just added on to that
That's right.
already coexisting thing. So it's one of the things that our community has done. The people who are online here know that there is an organization called Parkinson's Voice Project, and the founder essentially started a online exercise basically every day. So it's like Monday through Friday. You get online at 10 o'clock, and there's a link, and people join in, and she made them exercise, because you can imagine people
Right.
with Parkinson's disease not doing their speech therapy, very, very, especially advanced disease, very likely to lose their voice and have,
That's right.
swallowing difficulties. So that engagement, I think, was something that is, really, I mean, what I see through the pandemic is how the human spirit has really, um, just come out to demonstrate, how people can really get together and support each other, and especially with the Parkinson's community here is very strong. So
That's right. That's wonderful. Yeah.
yeah, and then also, like, access, right? What can you tell us about the impact of COVID-19 on access to like Parkinson's medications? I mean,
Yeah.
um,
That's something that was investigated by one of the the groups that I'm a member of, the study group, the epidemiology study group of our professional organization, the Movement Disorder Society. And at the beginning of the pandemic, what we did was we surveyed the members and asked them whether their patients in their experience had reduced access to medication as part of the pandemic. And what we found was that every part of the world, people said yes, but particularly the places that were impacted were the lower income countries or the lower middle income countries, and it kind of was a gradient. So the higher income countries, yes, it happened, but not with the same degree of frequency, whereas it was, I think, almost 90% in the lower income countries where the neurologists were responding to the survey. So it was a really big impact in terms of reduced access to medication.
absolutely. And also, I can just add on to procedures with botulinum toxins and with
Oh, yeah.
with DBS. I mean, it was such a challenge, and we literally, like, within a couple of weeks, we started just figuring out a way to at least get some of the people that were calling with, that one had needs for botulinum toxin injection that could not wait, right? I mean, there are some
That's
people who
right.
say, okay, my trauma is a little worse, but people who had pain and just so much disability
Mhm.
related to that. So, and same thing with DBS. Now, of course, we have a virtual platform, but that's only for DBS, but that's only for one device company and not the others. So that's also, it's definitely been a challenge. But
Sure.
um, so let me switch gears and talk about, like I said in my questions I sent over to you, literally kind of wrote the book on epidemiology of PD. When I think about you, obviously there's a lot of different things that you've done, but this one aspect of your work is definitely stands out. So maybe we can talk one by one about the impact of some of these factors on Parkinson's risk and progression. So Number one is, chemical exposure.
Right. So a number of different types of chemicals have been associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's. So one big category is pesticides. So pesticides means, herbicides and insecticides primarily that, have been used. It's hard to study these things because so many people can be exposed and not know about it. So some of the work we've done has focused on populations who use these in their work where they have to keep track of them. So they're able to accurately report what they've used. And we found that a number of different kinds of pesticides have been associated with increased risk for Parkinson's. So one of the ones that we found and others have found is the herbicide paraquat. Another one is rotenone, which is a naturally occurring, used to be used even in organic farming in California until people started studying it, isn't used very much anymore. Certain chemicals called organochlorine pesticides as well, and organophosphates. Permethrin, which is something that's been used even in military uniforms to keep away the mosquitoes, to protect people from malaria, but then your skin's always in contact with it. And in our farming group, it looks like that may too be associated with a higher risk of Parkinson's. So those are the ones we've been able to parse out. There are a lot of things that are very hard to study because many people, even if they're applying them, if they're not the person buying them and recording them, they don't know about it. And if you live next to a field where pesticides are being applied and they kind of blow over, you may not even know about it. You may not know what your exposure is.
I'm from, I usually just mute myself. So, I'm from, southern Louisiana, and so people like to fish over there, and they use rotenone basically to kill the weeds. And I think that when people fish, then the rotenone going into the fish and going into the human body, and of course not everybody has similar susceptibility for the toxin to cross the blood-brain barrier and get across, but certain people can, and that certainly puts them at a high risk for developing PD. Yeah, so there's been as you know, like Michael Oken and a group of people have been working really hard to kind of eliminate or reduce at least some of the toxins and the pesticides that should be banned, so that
Right.
more Parkinson's does not happen. So that's a really good initiative. So the second thing is head trauma. So of course there's always that debate with Muhammad Ali, how much of it was head trauma with dementia pugilistica, so to say, versus how much of it is was truly like so does that repeated head trauma, or can it be just one large TBI that can put you at risk? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we did some of this work in a population of veterans, and then other people have looked at it in other settings as well. But what we found is that having a head injury with loss of consciousness, but it can be fairly short, loss of consciousness, can predict a higher risk of Parkinson's many years in the future. And there's what we call a dose response. So if you have 2 head injuries, your risk is higher. If you have 3, it's even higher. So it does seem that there are probably various aspects of biologically what happens when you have a head injury that increases your risk for Parkinson's. And this is still an active area of investigation, but it's now been seen in a number of studies. So I do think that it's one of the things that increases risk. I also wanted to mention that there is another whole class of chemicals that we didn't discuss, which is chlorinated solvents, which are also associated with higher risk of Parkinson's in a couple of populations and are being investigated now. For example, people who served who were in the Marine Corps were civilian residents, at Camp Lejeune, Marine Base Camp Lejeune, are probably at higher risk of not just Parkinson's, but other diseases as well. And if you're a veteran, you're entitled to certain benefits if you have Parkinson's and you served at Lejeune for 30 days or longer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't know whether we talked about smoking. I don't remember if you mentioned during the course of our earlier talk about smoking as a, what is the impact of, people who smoke developing Parkinson's
I know
versus
it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because we
Yes.
hate to say
I
this
see
is a
so many.
case where it looks like maybe it's not such a bad thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it is true that in, probably more than 50 studies worldwide, all around the world, people who smoked cigarettes and in a few studies, people who used other kinds of tobacco, like smokeless tobacco, are at lower risk of developing Parkinson's disease. It's less clear after you have Parkinson's whether smoking or any exposure to the active ingredients in cigarettes, which we think of as nicotine primarily, does and makes any difference, right? So there've been studies where people tried to look at like the nicotine patch and see if that slows progression in Parkinson's, and that actually didn't appear to happen. But at least before disease onset, it seems that people who are exposed to cigarette smoke and or tobacco are at lower risk of disease. And there's some biologic reasons why that might make sense, because nicotine is one of the neurotransmitters in the areas affected by Parkinson's. And there's some people who work in the laboratory who've done models that show that there can be protective effects against animal models or biologic models in the lab of Parkinson's. So it makes some sense. We don't recommend smoking to people. And there's a group of people who say maybe it's not the smoking, maybe it's a personality characteristic that's present throughout life that goes along with people who are destined to get Parkinson's. So that's sort of a second opinion about what this association might be. I tend to think there is something biologic, partly because the smokeless tobacco, people exposed to secondhand smoke, also seem to be at lower risk of Parkinson's. So that, there's less of that evidence, but that's the reason I tend to think that.
Yes, although caffeine, so I have been, I think, drinking caffeine since probably the day I was born. And so I don't know whether that is going to put me at my mother's mother had Parkinson's in her 70s. Nobody else in our family has had Parkinson's, but I think I just inadvertently ended up drinking caffeine. But I don't know, maybe that will be neuroprotective, for me to not develop Parkinson's. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so there is the same kind of evidence that suggests that caffeine, if people who drink more coffee or have more caffeine intake are at lower risk of developing Parkinson's. And a study that I was involved in a group of men who have been studied in Honolulu. It's called the Honolulu Asia Aging Cohort. So they're men of Japanese ancestry. They were followed since they were about in their 40s until many of them donated their brains after they died. And if they had been heavy caffeine users, so they drank, 3 or 4 cups a day during life, they were much less likely to have what we call incidental Lewy bodies, meaning the beginnings of Parkinson's pathology, even if they didn't have Parkinson's, and they were less likely to get Parkinson's disease during life. So that's pretty strong evidence. There are some drugs, as you know, like one called istradefylline that has a similar effect biologically to caffeine. It works on adenosine A2A receptors, and it's being studied as perhaps a treatment that may be helpful for progression in Parkinson's. So I think there's biologic plausibility there. There are animal models, same way as with smoking. People have looked in the laboratory and found that affecting the system seems to slow progression in Parkinson's. So again, I think it's something that has promise, but isn't 100% proven yet.
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Tanner. Okay, and then we talked a little about lifestyle. Does milk have anything to do? Is consumption of milk a risk factor for
Yeah,
Parkinson's?
so that's another interesting one. So back to the Honolulu cohort I was telling you about. Another thing that we found was that people who had diets that had a significant component of dairy products were at a greater risk of developing Parkinson's disease and at a greater risk of showing the Parkinson's pathology after they passed away. And the interesting thing about that was that at that time in Honolulu, or in Hawaii in general, pesticides were used very heavily in like the pineapple fields and things like that. And then the leftovers, not the actual pineapple you eat, but the stems and things were chopped up and fed to the cows. And milk bioconcentrates chemicals that are fat soluble, which would include some of these organochlorine pesticides. So when we looked at the brains of people who had Parkinson's who had passed away in this cohort, we found more of those pesticides in their brains as well, in the areas associated with Parkinson's disease. So it's sort of, a lot of guilt by association. It's not a complete cause and effect, but it suggests that at least in some cases, dairy products may not be good, but whether it's the actual dairy product itself, whether it's something that's bioconcentrated in the milk, I think is something we haven't completely answered yet. So I tend to think, moderation in all things, and maybe, going for organic, and that may be acceptable, but I know there are some people who say you really just shouldn't eat dairy at all.
Yes, I mean, sometimes sugar is not good, sometimes dairy is not good. At some point,
Right.
I think, air is not good because it's polluted.
It's true, though.
I don't even know that, whether we are going to be able to eat or drink, anything, as
We
easily
can't
good.
help that, but air pollution is another one of the things that increasingly we're seeing,
Yeah,
is has an association with Parkinson's risk. So, yeah.
absolutely. So Dr. Tanner, I'll ask you, I want to leave some time for people to ask questions if they, have any. Shelley may have, if there's not a lot of questions from the audience, then I can always continue, have a whole set of things. But I'll just ask you one last thing about your, obviously famous study, that's the TOPAZ study, and what you can tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is an example of tertiary prevention. So this is a study we're doing right now. People can go to topazstudy.org. One of the things that's unique about it is that it is a home-based study. So you do not need to come into the medical center to be part of this study. And the goal of the study is fracture prevention. And what a lot of people with Parkinson's don't realize is that risk of fractures is much higher in people with Parkinson's than those without, probably for a couple of reasons. One is people fall more, but the other is that people are more likely to have what we call osteoporosis or osteopenia. So their bones are a little more vulnerable, men and women, not just women who have it a little bit more. And yet people don't take treatment for it. So this is a one-time treatment. It's given as an infusion. A nurse comes into the home, and then it tends to last in other people, general population, for a couple of years. It's a medicine that's been used for more than 10 years. for people with osteoporosis. And so we know a lot about its safety. It's safe and, you know, okay to use with Parkinson's meds. So we're actively recruiting. And thanks for mentioning it, because it might be something of interest to some of the people on the call.
Yes, absolutely. I think Mazen Elkard here was actually part of that, if I remember correctly. Mazen is, since he has left and gone to, just locally in town at Baylor University Medical Center. I wonder whether he took the study with him. I don't remember that, or whether he left it with, I'm not, I'm not part of the study, so I don't know whether he left it with someone or just left the
Would
study.
love to involve you.
Yeah,
If you're interested, let us know.
I think what we will have to do, Dr. Tanner, I would love to, but we've lost like 3 attendings in the last
Mm.
last couple of, we've lost 3 attendings. We're basically waiting to hire more, and there will be one that will be coming in January. So once he is here, I can certainly talk to him about whether he has the bandwidth and take on. I think that'd be something good
Keep
for
in
him to do to
touch.
start
Yeah.
out. Yes, definitely. I
Yeah.
will definitely reach out to you, and then my last question, and then I can turn it over to Shelley, is what can you tell us about the evolution of care partner burden, needs, and coping in patients with Parkinson's?
Yeah, so this is another thing that we've been investigating, especially through the Fox Insights study, where some of the people who are in that online study are the care partners of people with Parkinson's. And this is an area where not very much is known. There are significant needs, and it's not even well known what the needs are. What we have done is that we've set up, there's a care partners working group that's part of the Fox Insight team. And we started by just looking at what has been published and what are the gaps, and the gaps are fairly significant. There's not that much known, except that it's hard to be a care partner, and the more serious the illnesses in the person with Parkinson's as far as disability or cognitive change, the harder it is for the care partner. The more they get isolated, the harder it is to sort of, help them with their own health and mental health. So what we're trying to do is understand that more, and then be able to address interventions to make things better. So that's a big unmet need, basically.
Yes, and we talk about this like all the time, and we actually had care partners on the webinar and talking about their challenges and how they do it, and we've invited people in the past. So I think with that, thank you, Dr. Tanner. This is great. I can continue to talk to you and tap your brain and your experience for a very long time, but I also want to give maybe some questions. I can read these out. So you actually did talk about permethrin. So somebody wanted to know, is it that ingredient, which is the peperonyl butoxide ingredient, or is it like permethrin chrysanthemum derivative that is implicated in Parkinson's?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite got that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand that as well. So the question is, permethrin is the peperonyl butoxide ingredient, or is it permethrin chrysanthemum derivative that is implicated in Parkinson's? I don't know that.
So what we found was the actual pesticide that was being used by farmers. So that's the evidence that we were able to look at. Whether it extends to any other forms, it hasn't been investigated. I would say it's probably reasonable to be judicious. And I'll say that one of the things we did find when we were studying agricultural workers is that people who used protective equipment, who washed off if they had a spill, and who were careful, were not always at higher risk of Parkinson's. But people who were not careful and didn't wash and things like that were at much higher risk. So there are things you can do even if you use pesticides in your work.
Yeah. Has radiation work, so patient says I was a submarine officer, has radiation work been implicated in PD?
Not so far as I know. There was one study that sort of suggested that, but to my knowledge, there haven't been more replications. One of the studies I'm involved in is looking at military participants in the Milko study, and we may have an opportunity there. What we're looking at is a lot of military associated exposures, but I don't, not to date, no, is the answer.
Is there any correlation between Parkinson's disease and Raynaud's?
Again, not to my knowledge. Shilpa, do you? No?
No, I
Yeah.
don't think so. I mean, certainly, like, people who have autonomic dysfunction in PD or in multiple system atrophy can have the Raynaud's phenomenon, I guess, autonomic dysfunction, right? I mean, that's the
Mhm.
what I can think about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I took Cinnarizine for 3 years. 7 years later, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Is there any relationship?
So what was it they took for 3 years?
Cinnarizine. Cinnarizine, calcium channel blocker.
Yeah, Cinnarizine. Yeah. Possibly, I guess is the answer. Studies are a little bit controversial about that, but there is a possibility.
And I guess if you look at the list of medications implicated in causing Parkinsonism, both flunarizine and cinnarizine are on that list. And it's interesting. I had a patient yesterday that basically told me, he said that I took cinnarizine. I guess he had some kind of a cardiac rhythm or something for which he took that, and he said many years later I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And just like we tell people who take anti-dopaminergic medicines, right? I mean, sometimes it is medication induced Parkinsonism. You stop the medicine, it goes away. But in some patients, these medicines just unmask the pre-existing tendency for developing Parkinsonism. And just by using a medicine that blocks the effect of dopamine, just kind of accelerates the process, and they manifest onset of symptoms before what they would have otherwise manifested.
Yeah, if it's concurrent, for sure,
Yeah.
that's true. I think the other thing is that there are a lot of studies that look kind of at big medical record screens and things like that, and I think it can be a really useful approach. I'm not meaning to say it's a bad thing, but it can be confusing because people are prescribed medications for a reason, and sometimes it may be that itself could be a risk factor, or not a risk factor, but a predisposing factor to the illness as well, to Parkinson's. So I think it's hard for us to piece those things apart all the time.
Yes, absolutely. Does carbidopa, levodopa have any effects besides reducing tremors? Of course.
Oh yeah. So it can definitely be helpful for other features of Parkinson's. So slowness and what we call rigidity, or might be felt as stiffness, as gait, and can help some with balance, although none of these are perfect and it doesn't completely control the symptoms, but especially early in disease can be really quite helpful. And even later in disease, it has an effect. You don't want to stop it. It also has possible side effects, drug-induced movement disorders, or changes in thinking or concentration, or sometimes visual hallucinations. So all of these are things that could be associated with that medication, but it remains today the most effective drug that we have for Parkinson's. So I think that's really a strong statement, because we've been studying it now since the late 60s, right? That's when it first came out.
And I was also trying to explain to a patient who literally took himself off levodopa, carbidopa after having had DBS adjustment. And I was trying to explain to the patient that dopamine has non-motor benefits beyond just motor control. And I see people who, wear off dopamine, they develop anxiety that they didn't have. They develop, cognitive fog, low mood, drenching sweats, and so many things. So, the speech volume goes down. So there is definitely a lot of, things that dopamine does, as you said. Can you provide the link for signing up for some of these studies that are seeking participants?
I could. How should I do that? Can
you know,
I send it to you and then you can,
Yes, Dr. Tanner, if you send it to Shelley, she can send it to,
sure.
send it to me and Shelley, and we'll send it. Although I will say that if people go to, all of these studies need to be registered, so they should be part of clinicaltrials.gov or pdtrials.org. And so if they were to go there and, but again, I mean, screen through all the studies and see, it's just hard to go to another state to participate in a clinical study, on a regular basis.
Right.
And
although some of these studies are online, or they're ones where transportation is provided. So
no. So if you send it to Shelley, she can send it to everybody. So definitely,
I will do.
Are there any studies? I think we're getting close to top of the hour, but are there any studies that differentiates cognitive dysfunction in PD with other diseases with cognitive disorders?
Studies that differentiate them?
Yeah, differentiate cognitive dysfunction in PD versus other diseases that have cognitive, dysfunction.
Right. So there are sort of some clinical differences that in a general sense are true. And there are, sort of natural history differences that would separate, like say, Parkinson's from Alzheimer's, in terms of the symptoms and the progression. I think it's an imperfect situation, and lots of times people, when you look at their brains, after they've passed away, can have mixed pathology. But I think we have a general sense of how to do that, right? More work is needed for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, I think clinically, like Parkinson's disease presents with a, like, I'm preaching the choir with like what we would call like subcortical, presentation more than something like Alzheimer's, right? Would present with like, more like memory or things like that. So yeah, so then clinically, I mean, I think just doing neuropsychological testing can at least certainly give us some guidance as to what direction that this is going. So I think those were all the patient questions. Let me see if I have anything, in the 1 minute. I want to make sure that we get as much out of your brain that we can. I think it's pretty much covered. Maybe you can tell us your experience about telehealth during pandemic. Telemedicine.
I'm sorry. Oh, telehealth during the pandemic. Yeah. Right. So it's very interesting. At the beginning of the pandemic, again, the Movement Disorder Society telemedicine group did a survey, an international membership survey, and asked about sort of how telehealth was used in the time just before the pandemic and then afterwards. And, it's a wide range around the world. So Canada, for like decades, has had a really good telemedicine system that they've used to deliver health because they have such a disseminated population. South Korea, for example, it was illegal to use telemedicine to treat patients. So that was the contrast. With the pandemic, things normalized a little bit. So for example, it stopped being illegal and more people started using it. It's a barrier for a lot of people because while they could do it, they couldn't get paid for their time. And that changed a little bit too. So those things all changed during the pandemic. I think now we're further years down the road and things are kind of moving back a little bit closer to how they were before the pandemic. It hopefully maybe not quite as limited, because I think telehealth is very helpful for many people with Parkinson's, just because it's so hard to get into the clinic.
Yeah, so they used to have there used to be like you could see anybody from anywhere during the pandemic. Then it's just basically only state. And I've just been hearing from my friend who's a clinic director that the Medicare reimbursement for telehealth could possibly be reduced, in which case the universities will not allow for us to do telehealth because it will reduce the the productivity for faculty and the income. So but
Right.
I'm a big fan of telehealth under certain circumstances, especially follow-ups. Also,
Exactly.
with the virtual programming with the Abbott device for people that live far away, we
That's right.
like to kind of use that to have the fine-tuning. I think what, if anything, that the pandemic has taught all of us, especially those in the medical field, is having control, right? Losing control, not being able to reach people, not being able to provide essential services. I mean, for a Parkinson's patient, sometimes going to people were very afraid to go to the ER during the pandemic, and if they could just
Sure.
talk to us on telehealth, and we could
Mhm.
like tell them like, hey, listen, this is something we can resolve, versus, oh, this is serious enough that you really, unless you're having a heart attack or a stroke or something really bad, don't go to the ER, which is what we used to tell people.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
it's just been hard. But Dr. Tanner, this is very, very excellent. Thank you, for the great insight and the ease in which you answered all the questions. I think we all got a lot out of it. Shelley, you have any last remarks before we let everybody go?
No,
Yeah,
it's been
I
great to talk.
I agree with Shilpa. Thank you so much, Dr. Tanner. We will send out a recording to this webinar, so feel free to watch it again or pass it along to anyone that you think would be interested. And in that email, Dr. Tanner, I will connect with you offline and get those links to some of
Great.
those studies so that we can share it with our audience. And just as a reminder, guys, we have a lot of great programs at SkyPass Foundation. So if you haven't already, head over to our website, skypassfoundation.org. You can click on the Parkinson's tab up at the top, and you can see all of the different programs that we have for the community, for those that are local, as well as those that are all over the country. We've got some great online programs, so you can tune in from anywhere that you're residing. And if there's anything that we can do for you, you can always reach out to us at info@skypassfoundation.org. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you both again. Thank you, Shilpa. I appreciate your time. Dr.
Thank you,
Tanner.
Dr. Tanner. Hopefully, how's your grandchild?
Oh, he's great.
Wonderful. They are in DC?
No, they're in North Carolina, in
Okay.
Winston-Salem. Yeah, they're
Wonderful. I guess you're making a lot of trips.
taking a lot of trips. You're right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Enjoy. I remember when my
you.
parents became grandchildren, they almost literally forgot about us.
Grandparent syndrome for you.
Plenty of
Absolutely.
fun.
Well,
Right,
thank you
yeah.
everybody for being online, and thank you again, Dr. Tanner. Great pleasure and great honor to have you here.
Nice to talk to you. Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Have a great night.